Hello. Now we're going to have the last panel where we're going to talk about education, higher education, and the spaces it provides. First, I'll present Gerhard Richter, who is a professor in the Comparative Literature and German Studies Department at Brown, currently acting chair of the German department. Gerhard is a committed educator and thinker, interested in figures such as Walter Benjamin in the School of Frankfurt, Derrida, Adorno, Nietzsche, among others. He deals with topics concerning aesthetics and critical theory, and has a deep appreciation for his culture, its neighboring cultures, and in more broad sense, the human condition. He cares for the important pedagogical space that is the university, and as a student, I can say that its rich tradition is preserved through his work as an educator, never ceasing to encourage slow reading and the practice of thought.
And I will introduce Dorothée King. Dorothée's teaching is invested in contemporary and modern art history, participatory exhibiting, immersive environments, ephemeral materials, multisensory aesthetic experience, and the histories and futures of art school education. Dorothée has studied art, design, and media in Denmark, Germany, and England. And she published her first monograph in 2016 called Kunsten Reichen, sorry for butchering that, Smell Art. And Dorothée is interested in the role of smell as a contemporary fine art medium and as a means of engineering aesthetic experiences.
Our last panelist, Ian Gonsher, started off studying furniture design at RISD, and then working at Brown. He started in the visual arts department and branched out into engineering, computer science. He currently works in the Humanity-Centered Robot Initiative and teaches the engineering capstone design courses. And his recent work focuses on design strategies that blend creative practices across disciplines as a means of developing pedagogical strategies for teaching creative thinking. So, welcome our panelists.
So we are experiencing some technical difficulty with slides, but we'll save it soon.
Yeah, this panel is going to focus around some passages that we're distributing right now.
I have two. Oh, that's great.
Okay, can you log into your computer?
Of course.
Don't do that.
Yeah, we don't
Yeah, I
need
mean,
the slides, right?
if everybody has the passage,
Exactly.
then it's fine.
Let's kick it off then.
Okay. Well, thanks. Well, when Kay and Diego asked us to think about the concept of space and place in relation to education and in relationship to the university, we thought that it might be useful to begin with a short passage from a text by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. It's a text that he delivered almost 20 years ago as a keynote address at Stanford, and it's called "The University Without Condition." It's a complex, long, intricate essay, and we distilled 8 or 9 sentences out of this to get us going. Because we thought that the issues that Derrida raises here still are with us today. They haven't gone anywhere. In fact, they're perhaps even more urgent than they were 20 years ago. So perhaps what we'll do is we'll read a few sentences together and then think about this idea of a university without condition and what that might mean. All right? So here goes. I think you have the text in front of you. This university without condition does not in fact exist, as we know only too well. Nevertheless, in principle and in conformity with its declared vocation, its professed essence, it should remain an ultimate place of critical resistance, and, more than critical, to all the powers of dogmatic and unjust appropriation. I'm referring to the right of deconstruction as an unconditional right to ask critical questions not only about the history of the concept of man, but about the history even of the notion of critique, about the form and the authority of the question, about the interrogative form of thought. For this implies the right to do it affirmatively and performatively, that is, by producing events, for example, by writing, and by giving rise to singular oeuvres. This principle of conditional resistance is a right that the university itself should at the same time reflect, invent, and pose, whether it does so through its law faculties or in the new humanities, capable of working on these questions. Such an unconditional resistance could oppose the university to a great number of powers, for example, to state powers, and thus to the power of the nation-state and to its phantasms of indivisible sovereignty, which indicates how the university might be, in advance, not just cosmopolitan, but universal, extending beyond worldwide citizenship and the nation-state in general, to economic powers, to corporations and to national and international capital, to the powers of the media, ideological, religious, and cultural powers, and so forth. In short, to all the powers that limit democracy to come. The university should thus also be the place in which nothing is beyond question. Not even the current and determined form of democracy, not even the traditional idea of critique, meaning theoretical critique, and not even the authority of the question form, of thinking as questioning. Here then is what we would call, in order to call upon it, the unconditional university, or the university without condition. The principal right to say everything, even if it be under the heading of fiction and experimentation of knowledge, and the right to say it publicly, to publish it.
Thank you.
So perhaps we could take it from here and think about this
Right.
this unconditionality and the idea of a university space as a space of resistance and reflection.
Yeah, so we were thinking about unconditionality and if that's possible at all, as we think we always need conditions to know what's unconditional could mean or to experience that at all. And I think even at places like Brown and RISD, we face a lot of conditions still, even though it seems so free. Just talking about the economic powers, right? We all know about the tuitions we have to pay to get into these places. But still, I think it's interesting to think about how can we experience unconditional within these school-like settings that have certain parameters to care about. And I think at RISD, the first year, the foundation year, is a very good place to start, as there the students learn a lot of different things, so they get kind of a set of knowledge, and I think you need that before you can actually go on and to answer a question or to to deconstruct also.
Yeah, we had a really interesting conversation the other
Yes.
day about some of this. There are a few threads. One thing that I think was brought up was this idea, this Kantian idea, the condition of possibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I understand that is, Kant has this the problem he sets up is that, you have phenomena in the world which you experience, let's say subjectively, and then you have the thing in itself that's somewhere out there that's kind of vague in some way. And in order to have some experience of it, you have to have these conditions of possibility. So you have to understand it spatially, you have to understand it temporally. And these aren't necessarily conditions that exist out there somewhere. They're conditions of our faculty of representation, how the mind is kind of set up. And I think that there's something similar to what we're talking about in terms of the university. It's kind of what do we bring as those conditions, and maybe something we can talk a little more about is this idea of questioning, where he says the meaning of theoretical critique and not even the authority of the question form of thinking as questioning. And I think that there's something really interesting about that, thinking of questioning as this kind of, as I see it, and that's why I find this a little bit confusing, is questioning as being one of these conditions of possibility. And also, aside from that, thinking about the condition of possibility as being aligned somewhat with our notions of space, possibility in space, a kind of affordance for something to happen, like learning or acquiring knowledge or questioning. There's a lot there, I know, but that's kind of some of the things I took away from our conversation today.
I mean, I'm grateful to you for bringing up this question of the question here, because I think that's sort of a leitmotif that concerns all of us in different spaces and in different institutional settings. In another text, Derrida speaks of the community of the question. I've always thought that this was an interesting and an affirmative idea, where the idea is that those who make up a university are not a priori determined as a collective we or as having a certain identity, but they're part of a question mark. And the broadest thing that we could say about those of us who are at RISD and Brown and participate in a certain discourse are that we are, for all our differences, a community of the question and a community of the question mark.
Right.
Of course, with a question, there's always the sense that you're destabilizing something. We call things into question. We question things, yes. But I think what emerges in the university without condition is also the sense that that kind of questioning is an affirmation. It can be an affirmation. Yeah. I affirm by questioning, and the question mark is really a way of perpetuating even what I'm, about to move away from.
Right.
And so this kind of interplay between moving away from and affirming in the moment of the question mark is something I think that we should keep alive, and that is one of the challenges also of being in this kind of institutional setting. And then just maybe one footnote on the question of the question. There is that very strange moment in Derrida where he says that perhaps even the question form of the question needs to be questioned. And that seems at first very strange to us, because what could be more fundamental to the experience of the university than the question?
Right.
And one would have to be nuts to question this. But he wonders sometimes if there's something before the question. I mean, what if the question is not the primary mode? What if there's something before the question? And what could this be? And he's thinking there in terms of a certain relation to the other. The idea that I feel called upon, I feel this call of the world to relate to it at all, to even pose a question to it. And this, this has many inflections. You could think of it in terms of a Heideggerian being with, being a Mitsein, as Heidegger says, this being with, where this being with others is not simply a condition that is added on to my existence at some point, but I'm born into a being with, that I fundamentally share this world with others. So prior to the content of this or that question, I feel a fundamental connection or relatedness to the other. And this framework is precisely what prompts me to use something like the interrogative mode or the question mode to begin with.
Right.
And this goes beyond political division, this goes beyond ideological frameworks, this goes beyond departments and even the walls of an institution.
But you might take that question
Yeah.
further, and who is this other that's always already present? You know, this is it. And we were talking about Trump and all. You know, it's like who is it that we choose to engage with, and who has.
Yeah.
Who do we
But-
bring into these conditions of possibility, to the space that the question opens up for this kind of discourse? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think this questioning in a form of critique is kind of built into the teaching at RISD, right? You always do something, you work on projects, and then you have your critique, and then you go on. So this this questioning is part of the studies, and it's kind of also a good way. You have this fraction moment, and then you have open space after that, and you move on. But I think I like your idea about questioning the questioning, and I just read about Dieter Roth, this artist who works a lot with food and other stuff, and he was a guest professor at RISD in the 60s, and he decided to do teaching by non-teaching and just sitting there and not saying anything and just not even being like the counterpart for questioning in that mode. And I think that also again reminded me of Jacques Rancière and the ignorant schoolmaster, and this idea of just having a space where you don't even have the other to ask questions to, but you have to kind of grow yourself and open up the spaces yourself. And I think even though the critique is so institutionalized at RISD, I think it's always good to also question that system.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, at RISD, and anywhere, I suppose, you know, this idea of critiquing the critique,
Yeah.
I think is, and how do you begin a project like that? So, we talked a little bit the other day about this kind of idea of the dialectic, right? We talked about, you know, that, you know, you have this kind of negation, and that's what we tend to think of, or that's in the popular imagination. I think that's kind of what critique can sometimes come off as. It's a kind of negation of something. But on the other hand, we were trying to explore this idea of affirmation, or I would align with synthesis. You know, it's how do you bring things together without negating them or transcending that negation in some way. And that only solves half the problem, though, because if you're really trying to fundamentally question the question or critique the critique, somehow you need some new way of thinking, I think, that extends beyond that. And I'm still struggling with that. I don't know how you get beyond that, but I do think it's baked into that kind of idea of this idea of negation and synthesis, and how those things are play out in a kind of performative way through the critique.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's an important aspect to this very notion of critique. It comes. I mean, if you look at the history of critique, it comes to us from the Greek krinein, which is also related to crisis. It means to separate or to decide. Mm-hmm. So to criticize something is to pull something apart and to choose this path or that. It's the critical turning point of an illness. That's the crisis of an illness, at which moment it will be decided if I live or die, let's say. This is the turning point. So there's always some kind of affirmation in critique. Usually we think of critique as a parting from something, going the other way. But in going the other way, I also affirm something other than the critique object, even in moments when I may not know what that is yet. And for Derrida here, it could be the democracy to come, the kind of democracy that we're striving for on optimistic days. But that doesn't seem to be with us quite yet.
Yeah.
And that's not saturated yet, a concept that is not fully formed yet, that is not saturated yet but that intimates itself as a possibility.
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
there's a space there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there's a space of possibility,
Mhm.
an openness that is not yet filled.
Filled, yeah. But we talked about that in our meeting a couple of days ago, how we usually tend to only critique those things we actually care about. And when we want to see
Yeah.
grow and change, and yeah, so I think about also as like a motherly relationship to the university, even though you don't know
Yeah.
what the baby will be in the future, you still want you want like institutions for educations to exist, but definitely they should change and should grow with the times.
Well, it's your alma
Yeah.
mater, it's your nourishing
Yeah.
mother, but you also have to mother it. You have to be the child that mothers the mother.
Of course.
And mothering the mother, mothering the institution,
Yeah.
also means to criticize it.
Yeah.
And we may have to call into question what we're doing in our institutions, precisely to affirm it, precisely because we love it, because we want to be the mothering, the child mothering the mother.
Yeah.
And so if we can accept this idea of the unconditional university as preserving the principal right to say everything, and if we feel that is under threat, or that too many conditions are being put onto that,
Right.
I think we, as scholars and students at places like Risky and Brown, have the right to turn on our mother as well, and to be disobedient children of our nourishing mother and say, I don't recognize these institutions, I don't recognize Brown, I don't recognize Risky. We're going in ways that are at odds with a certain freedom and unconditionality of thought, with experimentation, with openness, and we're moving into dogma, or what in early Frankfurt School discourse is called instrumental reason, where what we do is immediately instrumentalized in the service of some determined outcome.
But as practitioners, I mean, as artists, as designers at an art school, I mean, isn't that what we do?
Well,
and I hear what you're saying at the beginning part. There's a kind of entry point in to have this kind of critical awareness, and it's not directed towards anything necessarily. It's just being for itself in some way. But at an art school, at a design school, where we're not, where how does he put it here? The producing events. How do we grapple with that instrumentality?
Yeah, I just on Thursday I was in a RISD meeting on VR and AR and how RISD should deal with these new technologies, and then there was a big discussion on, okay, we could work together with companies like Google and try things out, but then there was a huge outcry. It's like, no, we shouldn't be like consumers. Well, we should be Google. We should be the ones who actually design and program things and set standards and ask the questions and not just consume that. So I think especially, there's always has been new technology and new media, but even nowadays we still have to negotiate that and always kind of rethink our own position and re-critique our own position and step out of our comfort zone to actually truly make things and not just consume
I think
education
it's
and
very
consume
interesting.
Design. Yeah.
It's a very interesting example because I think one of the conditions when we're talking about back to like the John Maeda days and the conversations that came out of that. I think that's an excellent example of kind of the conditions that I think there's a productive tension there too. There are people on all sides that kind of think about these things.
No, it was a very constructive discussion. Yeah.
But this already kind of this idea that instrumentalizing thought is somehow to be avoided or is problematic in some way. And that's how are we kind of reinscribing these conditions in the critique of the conditions, which I think is part of what happens to some degree. That we don't want to get involved with Google or Facebook or something because there's we're placing constraints and conditions on without. I think what we were talking about the other day, trying to advocate for this kind of open space where there can be this kind of exploration, there can be this kind of engagement with the other. And,
Right.
if you don't think that Google is a great thing or Facebook is a great thing, that's a great example of another that we inhibit our we don't permit ourselves to enter into those spaces because of those preconditions that we place on ourselves. And I'm just wondering how we critique that critique. How do we move beyond that? How do we engage with that other that is, as an example of Google. It's a struggle, I think.
Yes, it is, and it's a complicated and very complex struggle. And I guess there are different ways of thinking about that tension or thinking about that struggle. One would be the traditional model of an external intervention, let's say. I relate to the critical object in this or that way, and based on that engagement, based on that critique, something happens or doesn't happen in the object, or the object or the idea or the institution can now be thought about in this or that way. So, but there's also this kind of, Derrida would call it, I guess, a deconstructive or self-deconstructive way, where what you might focus on is a certain tension within the object and idea itself. So in other words, rather than asking, how do I relate to something like Facebook, or how do I relate to something like Google, or something, one might focus on the internal tensions that are already operative, have always already, as they say, been operative in such a discourse. And rather than placing them there or arguing from the outside, showing how a seemingly dominant discourse may have masked a very interesting set of tensions in itself, usually for its own purposes, for the purposes of societal power, for the profit motive, for a bunch of other motives. But these are unacknowledged tensions. And so maybe part of thinking the unconditional university, the university of as critical resistance, is a way of affirming the space in which these unacknowledged tensions and perhaps even contradictions are made visible without knowing perhaps yet what we are going to do with it. So it could not be, not a political platform to be simply exploited, or not simply an agenda to be followed. But rather, there would be an unconditional university that is an open form of critique that exposes a series of issues, that exposes
But if it's
contradictions.
always open, if it's always an open space, it's always an open kind of set of questions, isn't that the paralysis that we were talking about, where a creative act to some degree is about making a choice. And in order to make a choice of this at the expense of that,
Put your mic close.
yeah, sorry.
Have you been able to follow any of this? Okay.
Oh,
Can't
sorry.
hear you. Why don't you say anything?
You should, yes.
Okay, let's start. Let's start from the beginning. Wait. Should I read this first? No. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. As a very practical step, I always encourage my students just to change the location. And I think that went very well as an example for Kay. She's joining Berlin play group I worked together in the past. Just really change your setting completely so you can understand your home settings again a little bit better and understand the conditions there. So you can actually start to criticize them and see what's really relevant and what's not. So it's just as a practical step.
But this idea of, placing yourself, so you're positioning yourself within a kind of field of possibilities,
Yeah.
right? Okay. And so, to Gerhard's point, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's the critique begins about kind of teasing out these tensions through this kind of perpetually open space, that it doesn't need to resolve itself in any way. It doesn't need to be instrumentalized itself. It doesn't need to be directed towards anything outside of itself. It exists for its own, sorry, is that?
Too close.
I'm having trouble with the mics today. It exists in its own kind of internalized space. And what we were talking about the other day, and a problem that I see or I find is that it seems like it's not only can that be paralyzing, but it can also be, it can be, I guess I'm trying to advocate for this, that the instrumentalization of these things is always part of it in some way. It always gets directed outwards, that you can't stay in that kind of open space forever. You have to have constraints, you have to have boundaries, you have to have conditions in order to act in the world.
Right.
Otherwise, it's pure thought. And even when I put these into words, I'm choosing one word over another word. I'm choosing one concept and another concept. And those other concepts may be part of, the metaphysics of presence of that idea that I'm trying to communicate. But at the same time, by committing to it, by giving it form, by speaking it, by writing it, by making an object, it is in the world, and it is instrumentalized at that point.
Okay.
And that's
it cannot but be instrumentalized in a way.
Right.
I mean, you cannot overcome, as if by an act of will, instrumentalization. I think that's true.
But what do we do with that? I mean, if we're...
But...
Yeah, I think...
What do we, I mean...
Coming down, I think it then needs really extraordinary teachers and students to facilitate that, to going through that. And we also talked about how you can feel totally paralyzed or just want to quit or everything. And it just reminds me of like Black Mountain College. And I think that the setting there was like this. So you wouldn't really choose a subject, and you would choose yourself when you would graduate and write, and you wouldn't know what the conditions were about the final test and so on and so forth. And that still kind of sets the standards on how we see art education today. But I think it needed these extraordinary people at that time, and also the willingness to go through that paralyzation state.
But that's instrumentalizing.
Absolutely, yeah. So I don't know how not to instrumentalize it.
It's such a tricky question.
Yeah.
It's such a difficult problem to think through. Let me just give you one very concrete example of a kind of instrumentalizing appropriation, let's say. At my previous institution where I taught before coming to Brown, there was a moment of great unrest among the students, political unrest. And they were fighting a good fight, I thought. The university had to devise a strategy for making all this dissent palatable, as they will do. And so first they tried force. They clubbed students into submission. This was not too long ago. This was not the 60s. This is only a few years ago out on the West Coast. And yet the students wouldn't quit. They would not give up on their very reasonable demands. And so if once that didn't work, the university instrumentalized them by making the next cover story of the alumni magazine about our student rebels.
Yeah.
And so on the cover of the next alumni magazine, you had these attractive young people engaged in the political struggle, and you opened up the magazine, and there was a long story about the history of political resistance at that university, for example. And so this act of resistance and political critique could be instrumentalized the way that the new stadium could be, or the new swimming pool, or anything else. And so it's just a silly example, but I think it tells you something about what happens to critical thought when it is sort of instrumentalized and reinscribed over and over and over again. And that happens with any instrumentalization on any side of the political spectrum, of course. And of course, there are moments when a decision is needed. There are moments. We could imagine moments in which a decision should be made and must be made, and intervention ought to take place. Let's say you're fighting fascism, a real fascism. It's not going to be, you cannot fight fascism by having a philosophical debate with the fascists.
But isn't that what's being advocated here? To find those spaces that are forbidden, that are taboo, that are outside of the comfort of where there's discourse. So maybe it's having a conversation with Nazis. That is outside of, that's not a condition of possibility, at least here, for obvious reasons. But, I mean, if we're really talking about these kinds of radical breaks, you know, this kind of radical questioning, otherwise it becomes something that's very safe and very tame, I think, you know. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm just saying that if there's, you know, if we are committed to this idea of questioning the question and really radically trying to kind of engage or understand the other who is radically other to us, that's an uncomfortable place to put ourselves in.
Well, that's good. That's
Yeah.
good. I think we should be in uncomfortable places. I mean, I tell my students, I hope that in my classes you are uncomfortable. I mean, I hope you're not paying all this money for me to make you feel comfortable. I mean, I didn't travel all this way to make you feel comfortable, and I hope you didn't come to Brown to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
This whole idea seems very antithetical to a university to me, and I hope that RISD and Brown will make you very uncomfortable. And so that's by no means a solution to anything, but it may be the beginning of a question that may not lead anywhere, and that may in the end not be enough. Maybe something else is needed, and you never quite know in advance. But the argument here, I think, is that it's a good place to start. This place of insecurity, this radical question, this moment of resistance, out of which something new can grow that you yourself may not even be aware of.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that you're not aware of it, because otherwise, you would just be sort of implementing a program, or following a recipe for something. But in this moment of not knowing, of being disoriented, and of putting everything, when you're putting everything on the table, let's not assume anything. Let's not assume that certain questions are off limit, for example. Let's not regulate discourses.
But we
Let's
would
not,
already do that. I mean, because...
less and less, I'm afraid.
So I have an announcement.
Here comes
The jazz band is waiting and they want to set up
Yeah.
on stage. But I really want to thank you all for ending our conference so well.
Bring the jazz band up.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah,
not
bring them up.
we're not at
Yeah.
odds with each other.
But we'd like to make closing remarks and end with the jazz. Is that all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Should we do questions? Should we
Oh,
do?
yeah.
Let's do like a few questions. It's
Let's
really
start the
important.
critique and start
Maybe
questioning.
with jazz in
And they
the
can
background.
set up.
Jamming.
Yeah, they can.
do some questions while they're set up.
That's
Okay. So are there any questions? Do you want to do?
This idea of critiquing and asking questions is huge. I think that's one of the biggest things you learn at college and at a university. People nowadays, they have so much access to information, they'll oftentimes just look for the information that makes them feel comfortable and not really question. So RISD does this. I get the initial courses, you have a survey of different disciplines that they go through. Brown takes a completely different approach and says, just find stuff yourself, find a concentration. But I guess eventually both groups of students get put to this highest level of questioning. I think in the sciences, you do it in an introductory course, you can, but you don't really get the essence of it until you start doing science yourself and asking questions that haven't been answered. Is that the common theme, that at some point along the way you will start asking questions that really don't have textbook answers and learn where to find good sources of information and how to sort of research this? Can you do that in a survey, in a survey level in year one, or is it something that requires sort of an in-depth study over a longer period of time?
I have a couple quick thoughts. One just kind of tying in kind of the last thought with that is I think that we choose the institutions we want to be a part of. So, and those are, we choose the kinds of the norms and of the communities we want to be a part of as well. And so I think, Brown is a good example of this. You have, the open curriculum is not as open as people like to make it out to be. It was like your, the synapses, right? That, it was beautifully illustrated. You could make that analogy to the Brown curriculum. You have one path, somebody goes down one way, and then it widens the path more, and then more people go, and then next thing you know, you have this highway there. And I think in practice, aside from the curriculum, aside from all the kinds of deep kind of institutional structures. I think that where it really becomes interesting and where the new questions emerge is where students are able to kind of there's a kind of emergent kind of pattern that starts to occur where they start to follow one another, they start to ask one another, and they bring the professors into it. I think it's much more bottom up than it is top down in terms of kind of how those neural pathways start to get formed. But I do think that there's a kind of self-selecting that's part of that too, which goes to what we were talking about before, is that there are conditions that are in play. There are constraints, and those constraints are what it's the pruning in the mind metaphor. And yes, that allows for those pathways to become stronger and stronger over time, but they also place conditions and constraints, which I think is something that we are struggling with as well, and how do you deal with that?
But I think that's a culture that has to be developed and taught, and that cannot be set through curriculums or classes or so, but I think that's a culture that has to be learned through interactions with the other students, but also with the faculty body. And in my classes, I always just engage them to go beyond Wikipedia, and even though that's great, as we talked about, and beyond, the usual sources. And I think that's just something to grow into, to ask questions. And there has to be a willingness to go there, to ask questions. But usually, if you go to places like Richter and Brown, you know what you got yourself into. So, yeah.
And perhaps one of the dimensions of critique that we can perhaps hope to keep alive at institutions such as Richter and Brown is the idea that there's a difference between information and knowledge. And I think we're increasingly living in a world in which the two are conflated. Sometimes people ask me, well, why pay that much money to go to Brown or to any college, really? You can look it all up on Wikipedia or online in seconds, yes. But there's a difference between information and knowledge. There's a relationship to knowledge, to information and to thinking that I think has to do with experience and with the experience of being in the community of a question, in the community of a question mark. And whatever this experience will have been, if there's a future for universities, and it's uncertain whether universities as we know them will survive, or will they be superseded by something else, I don't know. But if they survive, I think it will have something to do with thinking about this difference between information and knowledge, and about what it means to ask a question and how we can give shape to the question mark.